Hey friends, tonight we step into the mist-soaked highlands and candlelit halls of medieval Scotland, where stone, song and stubborn hearts shaped a nation at the edge of the world. Before we set off, if you genuinely enjoy deep dive history, told with a little wonder, tap like and subscribe. It helps more than you think. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I love seeing this little traveling campfire circle the globe. Now, lower the lights, maybe crack a window or turn on a soft fan for that gentle background hum, and let the day slip off your shoulders. This journey is educational, story-driven and YouTube-friendly. No gore, no jump scares, just the true wondrous tale of how a people carved identity from wind, water and will. We'll begin before there were kings at all, when clans warmed. Their hands beside lochside fires and crannogs and brochs stood like early promises against the weather. We'll walk the line Rome drew at Hadrian's Wall, hear the whisper of Pictish symbols on standing stones, and watch an Irish monk named Columba light Iona like a lantern on the sea. We'll sight Viking sails on the horizon, feel the thrum of oars, and see how raiders became neighbours. We'll meet Kenneth MacAlpin gathering threads into Alba, stand beneath the teeth of Edinburgh and Stirling, and look past legend to the real Macbeth. Then it's the spark of Wallace, the iron patience of Robert the Bruce, and the hedgehog forests of spears at Bannockburn. We'll endure feuds, watch the Stuarts stitch power to pageantry, grieve at Flodden, walk the markets of the Burrs, and at last witness two crowns settle upon one head. Ready? Breathe in the heather. The wind is changing. Our story begins at a fire by the water, with a name spoken softly, Alba. Part 1. Alba before kings, close your eyes and let the mist do the map-making. It lifts from dark water in pale skeins, draws pale silver around a ring of stones, threads through bracken and broom, and then, almost shyly, reveals a house on stilts, timber legs rooted in the loch, smoke wandering from its roof. A crannog, half home, half harbour, anchored to a watery mirror. Far on a ridge, a circular rampart holds the hill like a clenched fist. That is a broch, stone stacked tight, an eye for raiders, and a refuge against night. This is Scotland before. Scotland Alba before kings, not a banner but a braid of clans. No heralds yet, no royal chancery. Identity is stitched from closer cloth, kinship, land and the names of your dead, whispered as if they could hear you, because perhaps they can. The world is busier than it looks. Groves breathe, rivers remember, stones keep counsel. Priests and judges, druids to later tongues, hold the law not in books but in memory. Around firelight stories do the binding. They are maps when maps are rare, compasses when stars hide, and medicine when wounds aren't of the flesh, do not. Let a single word Celt convince you a single people once marched here in lockstep. Celtic culture is a patchwork spread across old Europe, and northern threads weave their own pattern. Languages will lean over centuries toward Gaelic, but for now the tongue shifts valley to valley. Close cousins, not twins. Here, warriors, carry spears and oval shields, paint their skin when the old rites ask, and keep cattle as wealth that moves on four legs. Winters are teachers, stern and repetitive. Springs arrive like forgiveness. Fields are scratched from stubborn earth. Woods are both storehouse and uncertainty. Clans are not families as a ledger would list them. They are promises. You belong. To the hearth you defend, and the hands that lift you when your strength drops into the mud. A clan is insurance, defense, history and home. Betrayal. There is no word sharp enough for it in a place where your back is only as safe as the cousin behind you, and yet this is no timeless sleep. Forces beyond the mountains have begun to turn. Their gaze north, and the old gods feel the draft under the door. Traders bring the glitter of foreign metal and gossip of empires so large they need roads to remember where they've been. Rumour arrives before soldiers. It says the south grows walls to measure its fear and discipline to lengthen its arm. Before that arm ever reaches, Alba learns itself the hard way. Clash and reconciliation, feud and feast. Clans dispute grazing, timber, the insult never fully forgotten. A stolen cow is a debt that reproduces. But when a greater shadow breathes, over the ridge even pride is practical. Ties that fray in peacetime braid themselves into temporary ropes. The pattern once made will repeat for centuries. Fierce independence married to fierce defense, a paradox that becomes a signature. If you walk the loch's edge at dusk, the religion of the place is not hidden. A carved stone holds a spiral whose meaning the moss remembers better than you do. A river bend carries offerings, a brooch shaped like a bird, a shard of coloured glass, a prayer that never learned to read. The sacred is not far. It is the texture of daily use. When strangers in later centuries preach a single, jealous heaven, they will find ears already tuned to a world alive with attention, ready if wary to be convinced. This is the soil from which all later banners rise. Endurance first, then taste for story. Loyalty first, then appetite for lore. Even the kings who are still only possibilities in the fog will have to bargain with these older sovereignties. The clan, the land and the tale told well enough to outlive the teller. Long before a royal court demands allegiance, belonging has already been sworn. To the people whose faces you know in darkness, to the hill that knows your footfall, to the loch that keeps your house standing when the shore goes soft. Remember, this beginning when castles arrive, when saintly hands copy books on islands rimmed with foam, when merchant French replaces fireside Gaelic in certain streets, when archers and horsemen and cannon shout that the world has become complicated. Nothing new is ever entirely new. The shape of the future is doodled here in early ink: resilience, kinlaw, place memory, and the habit of surviving what you cannot afford to understand. From the far south, riders swear they have seen a wall that tries to hold a horizon in place. Let them build it. The mist is patient. Alba has learned to move through what others call barriers. It seeps, it rises, and by morning it is everywhere you forgot to guard. Part 2. Rome draws a line stand on a windswept ridge until your cheeks are bitten pink and your ears carry the sea's far rumour. Now open your eyes to a straight astonishment. Stone marching from coast to coast, 73 miles of intent, a ditch like a claw across the land, mile castles winking like beads on a taut string. It is Hadrian's Wall, not merely a fortification, but a sentence the empire writes in rock, this far and no further. Year 122 CE. Rome boasts continents in its pockets, and calendar months named for its favourites. Emperor Hadrian visits Britain and decides that conquest without end is conquest without wisdom. Caledonia, the old name for Scotland, proves not only hard to take, but expensive to keep. The tribes north of the line move like water. They do not present a single throat to seize. They offer 1,000 needles. So Rome does what it is best at. It organizes the unknown and calls it safety. But frontiers are not only edges of fear, they are melting pots of habit. In the shadow of the wall, the world gets crowded. Within the garrisons, you hear accents from Spain, Syria, and North Africa. A man born where the sun is an artist learns the Scottish rain's unoriginal persistence and curses in 3 languages, as he seals his sandals with more care than he gives his prayers. Markets bloom, taverns argue, temples to foreign gods stack along the road like visiting cards, altars and shoes and coins drop into the earth and wait centuries for shovels to remember them. The wall itself breathes. Patrols creak over it by moonlight, messages hurry along it by daylight. The Mile Castle is both barracks and neighbourhood. Soldiers grumble about pay, trade charms for luck, carve a lover's name into a stone that will outlast them, and watch the northern haze for motion. Sometimes that haze moves with purpose. Raiding parties learn the rhythm of Rome's routines, choose their moments, and vanish into the folds of the land. A generation later, the empire tries a bolder line, the Antonine Wall, shouldering farther north toward modern Glasgow. Grass. And stubborn people conspire. The legion pulls back to Hadrian's original thought. Caledonia has the last word. For now, what does a wall do to identity? South of the stones, a frontier becomes the theatre of imperial pride, a tourist attraction for senators and a reassurance for farmers. North of it, the same stones turn into compliment. They built this because they could not build us, whispers the glen, and the whisper becomes a myth that raises children with straight backs. The Picts, the painted ones, as Roman tongues called them, earn a reputation properly sharpened by their enemies. They are not a mystery to themselves, but they are content for Rome to be mystified. Walk along the surviving pieces today, where the wall dips into pasture, where it disappears into churches it inadvertently helped to raise, and the quiet is almost theatrical. Grass makes peace, sheep ignore empire. But listen closer. A frontier never truly sleeps. It leaves habits behind, measuring, counting, guarding, recording. Those habits will seep north like the mist once seeped south. The idea of a border will outlive the border's stones. To a land that values undefended spaces, that idea will be both threat and opportunity. Yet the wall did one thing no sword could manage. It taught both sides to imagine each other. The northerner learned that the southern giant grows weary, bureaucratic, and fond of forms. The legionary learned that a landscape can be an ally cleverer than any general, and that a people who know its moods can become the weather itself. Out of this mutual education, history takes a favorite pattern, resistance that writes the resistor. Scotland will carry the lesson forward. You can be yourself because someone tried to make you otherwise. In the evenings, the garrison cooks stew that tastes of home only if you squint your tongue. A Syrian soldier lays an offering to a god who appreciates cumin. A Spaniard raises a cup to heat that never visits. They are veterans of empire. They understand what their wall means. Control, yes, order, yes, and also advertising. A handsome skyline to reassure the anxious. The tribes beyond do not require reassurance. They are not seeking Rome. They are seeking sunrise cattle and the nearest kin who will stand when whistled for. When the empire thins, as all empires do, the wall will find other uses. Farmers will steal its stones for cottages. Masons will borrow its symmetry for churches. The line will blur, as lines always do, but the rumour of it, the boast and the boundary, will pass into Scotland's bloodstream as a trace mineral. The north will wear the boast like a medal that Rome inadvertently minted for it, and the boundary like a dare to be crossed in ways iron cannot catalogue. Remember the sentence written in rock, this far and no further. The next chapters of the story are dedicated to arguing with that sentence, not only with spears and night raids, but with culture, faith, and a patience that outlives engineers. The wall taught the land to speak in long tenses. Scotland learned to answer the long way. Part 3. Painted stones, sea roads picture two worlds so close that a hawk could cross between them on a single wingbeat. And yet, for centuries, they look at each other like mirrored strangers. In the east and north, the Picts set kings on hill-fort thrones and mark their presence with symbol stones, eagles, crescents, mysterious rods, images that refuse to translate cleanly, as if their meaning were bred to resist captivity. Their power runs along old ridges and through families whose names are more oath than ornament. In the west, across the glittering strait from Ireland, arrive the Scots of Dalriata, seafarers whose ships make roadways out of tide. They bring a language that will shape the centuries, Gaelic, and a habit of looking toward horizon lines for answers. Do not imagine a neat border. The seam is ragged as shoreweed. At times, Pictish riders push west, their standards pricking the light. At times, Scots beach their hide-hulled boats on new inlets and plant kin like seeds. Trade moves where it wants saltfish this way, fine metalwork that gossip always both ways. Intermarriage knits a lace too fine for chroniclers to map, and yet rivalry remains the default setting. Honor scratches quickly, memory heals slowly. What binds them, when anything binds them at all? At first, necessity. In the far distance, the Roman hand flexes and then withdraws, leaving a vacuum that invites ambition but also uncertainty. Later, a more thunderous teacher arrives. Viking longships carved with beasts for bows, their striped sails like warnings you can see from prayer. The Norse do not request invitations. They blow the door off. They burn, plunder, and, more consequentially, stay. Especially in Orkney, Shetland, and the Hebrides, they write new place names into the map, and new fears into the year. Against them, both Pict and Scot learn there are enemies more persuasive than cousins, and there is a second kind of glue, finer than fear and more enduring, story and faith. Even before a monk sets his oar into the Minch and points his coracle toward Iona, there are whispers of holy men and travelling teachers, of symbols that look less like beasts and more like crosses. The ground is not empty of reverence. It is simply waiting for a different grammar. When St. Columba arrives, he will in our next part, he won't so much light a fire as gather coals already glowing in the ash. The Picts are not a cipher to themselves, but to outsiders they are pleasingly opaque. Their stones do our imagination the courtesy of refusing a single reading. Taebor might be a clan, a feat, a prayer, or a warning, perhaps all at once. This resistance to translation becomes a kind of privacy that later ages mistake for disappearance. They will not vanish, they will merge, a verb that preserves more than it admits. The Scots, for their part, are not merely invaders with neat beards and hopeful genealogies. They are settlers, sailors, deal-makers, and keepers of a speech that will eventually drape much of the land. Both peoples understand kingship as a negotiation, not a birthright guaranteed by grammar. In Pictland, matrilineal principles thread succession through the mother's line. In Dalriata, sea lanes make alliances as binding as blood. Thrones are chairs with wheels. A wise king naps with one eye open and a ship ready. A foolish one discovers how quickly the wind can change meanings. If you seek the mood music of this age, listen for oars in unison. The sea is the quickest road and the most democratic of tyrants. She will carry you if you know her, drown you if you presume. On her skin travel gifts and grievances, news and knives, books and blades. Monasteries will dot the fringes like lanterns, each teaching its own neat hand to boys who will one day whisper power to men who cannot read. Between hill fort and priory, a conversation begins, sometimes in steel, sometimes in psalm tone. So how do two worlds become one kingdom without erasing themselves? Slowly, and then, according to the hindsight of later scribes, all at once. Kenneth MacAlpin will gather threads the way a patient weaver gathers warp, but he will not invent the loom. The loom is already here, shared danger, shared saints, interlaced inheritance, and the weary pragmatism of peoples who discover that survival paired with pride requires compromise with a better name. Walk a Pictish valley at dawn. The stone you pass has a serpent on it, abstracted into elegance. Its curve is the curve of a word you don't know you know. Now walk a western strand at dusk. The tide leaves weeds and a line of shell that looks like a script someone wrote too fast. In both places, meaning refuses a single tongue. It asks instead for a kingdom bilingual in its own soul. When longships torch a monastery, they do not burn the idea of it. When a hill fort falls, its view remains. The Picts will hold their ground and give their symbols. The Scots will hold their speech and give their sea roads. The result will not be subtraction. It will be Alba, a name that used to mean simply the island, now leaning toward a people's project. And just off the coast, an island shaped like a prayer waits for a tall monk with a determined oarstroke. He's about to translate light into a language both tribes can hear. But that is another candle. For now, fix this image. Painted stone, and heather wind, a boat nosing into a cove, two histories standing on the same beach unsure whether to fight or to share a fire. The tide, as always, recommends patience. Part 4. Iona's Lantern, St. Columba and the Spread of Christianity. At the rim of a weather-bitten sea, a small boat noses through indigo swells. The craft is little more than leather stretched over a patient frame, an oarstroke of stubbornness against the Atlantic's broad indifference. In it stands a tall monk, with a gaze that keeps its own horizon. Columba, son of island storms, carries no sword, only books and brothers, and a fire that won't go out when it meets the wind. The year remembered is 563. By then, Columba's life already has the ache of legend, quarrels among princes and clerics in Ireland, a shadow of blood that drove him toward exile or penance. Versions vary the way coastlines do, but all versions agree he crossed water to seek peace with purpose. The island that received him, Iona, is a stone prayer. Short grass, hard rock, gulls that speak frankly about weather. There he set timbers, raised a chapel, and planted a monastery like a lantern on a dark sill. Picture the place not as a postcard, but as a machine of meaning. The cells are small. The food is honest. A bell calls the hours. The psalms braid themselves into the work and then into the bones. A scriptorium breathes at the center. Ink, vellum, the slow choreography of copying. A boy learns how to make letters behave. A man learns how silence says more than he can. On winter nights, the wind writes commentary against the walls. In summer, boats arrive with questions. Columba sails not to conquer but to translate. He brings a story the clans already half know. That the world is alive with attention, that oaths matter, that mercy has power greater than the sharpest spear. He threads that story into a single name and a single cross, and, this is his genius, he speaks it in a language people recognize: courage, loyalty, kinship. Faith under Columba's hand is not a foreign coin. It is local currency stamped with new kings. Stories answer stories. Around fires, whispers swell into tale. Columba, who calmed a storm with prayer. Columba, who healed a sick child. Columba, who faced a river beast on the Ness, with nothing but a raised hand and a command. Miracle or metaphor, the tales do their work. They lean fear toward wonder and wonder toward trust. Where trust goes, baptism follows, and with it a network of monasteries and friendships that ignore the quarrels of kings even as they advise them. The monk's path is not only through glens and over braes. He walks into royal halls as well. Chronicles remember his meeting with Bride, a Pictish king near Inverness. We do not have their quotes, only their consequence. Doors opened, crosses in Pictland and the first green stitches between Pict and Scot. Stitches a sword could never make. Kings begin to see the utility of sanctity. A blessing can do what a border cannot, make loyalty feel like destiny. Iona grows into a harbour of learning. From its choir of stones go out men with tough feet and soft voices, founding houses in places that smell of peat and brine. They carry moving libraries in their heads, hymns for hard mornings and a grammar of hope. They teach writing to those who would wield influence and conscience to those who already do. The land absorbs the habit of keeping records, of marking time by feasts and fasts, of binding oaths not only to ancestors, but to heaven. Kings take note. A Christian king can write letters beyond the sea and be answered. He can marry policy to pilgrimage, drape law in litany, and claim a lineage that runs not merely to some warlike forebear, but to saints whose relics smell of eternity. Columba baptizes rulers and civilizes ambition, not by making it smaller, but by teaching it to imagine a common good. Do not make a saint a statue. Columba is not porcelain. He is flint, sparks when struck, a temper that discipline sharpens, a will that bends only upward. He fasts as if hunger were a door. He prays as if speech were a river. He corrects with a shepherd's crook, not a soldier's lash. And when he fails, as all men fail, he repents in public, which is rarer than a miracle and more instructive. The island becomes a place where kings wish to lie down at the end, and for centuries burials on Iona whisper that holiness can shelter even a crown from oblivion's wind. High crosses carve theology into weatherproof stone, scripture braided with knotwork, beasts tamed into borders, the world held in a circle that refuses to break, but the sea keeps its own calendar. In later centuries, Viking prows will knife through the same blue that once cupped Columba's coracle. Fires will find timber and roof. The sand will glow a wolfish orange. Books will scatter into smoke and ash. Some will be saved, and the saving of a single leaf will feel like the rescue of a town. The monks will flee and replant, carrying relics inland. Dunkeld will receive what waves threaten to take. Even ruin becomes a chapter, not an ending. The light moves, but it does not go out. On a certain night in 597, the chronicle says, Columba knelt in his small chapel and let his last breath travel the stone the way salt travels the skin of sea cliffs. The brethren sang him a cross. They kept his words as if they were tinder. And so they were. In the centuries that followed, when clan and crown wrestled, Iona's grammar, prayer, learning, law would keep teaching the same lesson, that unity cannot be hammered into men. It must be taught into them, sung into them, written into them, loved into them. When later voices cry out on battlefields and royal stones bear the weight of new kings, the echo will come from this wind-swept island. A monk once built a lighthouse of pages. Scotland learned to navigate by it. Part 5. Dragon ships in the haze. Vikings, raiders, settlers, and sea kings. First, a rumour, a monastery torn like linen by hands that smelled of salt and iron. Year 793 becomes a bell tolling across the islands. Lindisfarne struck. The holy made helpless. The sea turned into a road for sudden danger. Scotland listens, and soon enough it does not need to listen. It sees. The northern horizon grows prouder with dragon-headed prows, striped sails pulling wind like teeth, oars biting water in a rhythm old as muscle. The first arrivals burn like weather that hates you. Orkney and Shetland feel the lash, then the Hebrides, then the long western ribs of the mainland. Monasteries fat with silver and books become the magnets no raider resists. Bells go silent. Ash writes on the air. Fishermen count their children twice at dusk. Watchmen learn a new habit. They read the sea the way shepherds read sky. But the Vikings do not remain only thunderclaps. They come back with wives, cattle, and ploughs, and the storm lowers itself to live among the stones. Longhouses rise close to beaches. Runic habits carve their way into wood and thought. What began as plunder becomes presence. The Jarls of Orkney rule with eyes on Norway and hands on local law. Shetland follows the same North Star. In the Hebrides, a braided realm grows, the kingdom of the Isles, its rulers more at home on a deck than in a hall, its borders traced by tide rather than hedge. Name the places aloud and hear their hybrid parentage: Ness, Dale, Stir. Toponyms keep receipts. A Pictish farmer and a Norse settler share a fence. They also share weather and, eventually, grandchildren. A Gaelic lullaby learns a Norse refrain. A Norse tale learns to love a Gaelic hero. This is how invasion becomes culture, without ever ceasing to be caution. Don't polish the edges. Conflict returns frequently, as if a raider's oarstroke can echo for generations. Hill forts burn. Coastal farms wake to hoofbeats not their own. Yet even as spears answer spears, a different arithmetic tallies gains. The North Atlantic opens. Scotland is plugged not only into Norway and Denmark, but into Iceland, Greenland, and rumour says even rocky shores past that, where the world smells of pine and novelty. Goods move. So do ideas. The longship, shallow draught, fierce grace, becomes a teacher. It shows that mobility is sovereignty. For the Picts and Scots, the Norse presence is a pressure that moves history forward like a hand on a shoulder. Petty rivalries find themselves outbid by a larger threat. Kings recruit alliances they once thought undignified. A chapel on a lonely island learns to cut watch slits into its humility. When Kenneth MacAlpin later gathers a kingdom out of cousins, you will still hear oars in that decision. A man can be clever, yes, but the sea can make him cleverer. What did settlers bring besides axes and gods with hammered brows? Techniques, shipwright's craft, fishing arts, ways to read darkness by stars. Law that recognizes assemblies and oaths, sworn where wind can carry them. What did they take? Space, often rudely. Treasure, sometimes sacred. Certainty, almost always. And yet between taking and giving a third thing appears hyphenated identity. In the Isles you will meet men comfortably both Gael and Norse, their hearts calibrated to tides and kin alike. They will marry into clans and bend the clans toward the sea. The Jarldom of Orkney grows so strong that its story bleeds into sagas. Those ice-bright narratives where honour is a blade and luck a god with errands elsewhere. From their harbours, Jarls look south with one eye and east with the other. Sometimes they kiss the Norwegian ring, sometimes they spit into the Scottish wind, and sometimes they count their ships and decline all invitations. Meanwhile, on the mainland, the crowns that dream of unity must reckon with sea kings whose castles are fleets. Sieges mean little to men who can take up a town and put it down 3 islands away by next moon. Victory, if it comes, arrives not by crushing but by absorbing, by making room within a kingdom, for men who do not love fields as much as they love currents. Over centuries those rooms will fill. The Scottish crown will tug the Isles nearer, sometimes by treaty, sometimes by pressure, sometimes by the gravity of a culture growing confident in itself. The monasteries rebuild. A new generation of monks copies gospels with marginalia that look suspiciously like longships tamed into vines. Crosses rise again, but their stone now remembers flame. They preach resurrection to the landscape itself. Farmers learn to signal. Fisherfolk learn to hide their boats behind islets, the way rabbits find bracken. Resilience becomes a style. Step onto a Hebridean shore at dusk. The tide leaves a script in kelp and shell. Gulls annotate. A Currish and a Nar pass each other close enough for greetings in accidental tongues. On a distant hill, the smoke of peat curls and repeats an old argument. Is a stranger still a stranger when his grandchildren know the local cow paths by heart? The answer is complicated the way families are. When later kings claim they have bound this archipelago into a single story, remember how the story was actually made. By weather, by hunger, by boats, and by the stubborn human habit of belonging, even where your grandfather swore he never would. Dragon ships came with terror on their prows. They stayed with children in their cradles, barley in their fields, and names that do not wash out of the map. The storm that settled down became part of the climate. Part 6. The Making of Alba. Kenneth MacAlpin and a Kingdom begins. Imagine a table where two long-feuding families finally sit, not because they are reconciled, but because the roof is on fire. Around them the wind smells of salt and ash. From the west come Norsemen who do not ask permission, and from the east, rumors of neighbors who will test any border that looks unsure. At such a table, compromise ceases to be a virtue and becomes a strategy. Into that room steps Kenneth MacAlpin. The century is the 9th, the conventional date remembered as 843, though history seldom respects round numbers. Kenneth is a Scot, king in Dalriata, but his claim runs on more than appetite. Through marriage and maternal lines, he can argue his way into Pictish halls. And if crowns were awarded for timing, he would deserve 2. The Pictish world is strong but fractured, its laws threaded with matrilineal expectations that complicate succession, its defences tugged thin by Viking pressure. The Scottish world is ambitious, but constrained by mountains and the sea road's uncertainties. Kenneth understands that survival dressed as unity might be the only fashion anyone can afford. A legend, the treachery of Scone, tells it with theatre. Pictish nobles invited to a feast. Benches sawn, the unready collapsing into a blood-practical coup. It's a story that satisfies the appetite for drama, but lets nuance starve. The likelier truth is slower and smarter. Alliances, claims, marriages, maneuvers, and above all context, did the patient work. Yet the legend knows something the minutes do not. People wanted Scotland's birth to feel like a thunderclap. Destiny sells better than administration. What Kenneth does undeniably is shape a centre. He moves focus towards Scone, where an old block of sandstone waits like a patient covenant, the stone of destiny. Upon it, kings will sit and feel the country's weight come up through their spine, an initiation as much geologic as political. The ritual makes a promise back in time to heroes and forward in time to heirs. Our rule is not just a choice, it is rooted. Even enemies will respect the audacity of symbolism. Centuries later, an English king will haul that stone away to make a point. That theft, too, will make a point he didn't intend. Kenneth's consolidation is practical, not merely sacred. He understands that a kingdom is not a poem. It is logistics. He likely moves relics of St. Columba from vulnerable Iona to Dunkeld, tucking holiness inland, where longships can't reach so quickly. He begins to sketch a language of office, the more mayors and under-kings whose cooperation a crown must choreograph. He does not erase the Picts, he absorbs them, which is slower and far more permanent. The Gaelic tongue learns to dress Pictish memories. Pictish blood learns to call itself Alban without spitting. Do not think the land suddenly sings in unison. Alba, the name that once meant the island, now narrows to a people's project, but its chorus is uneven. In the north and east, old ties hold fast. In the west, sea lanes still think in Gaelic. The highlands will take longer to hear any king who lives beyond the next ridge. The lowlands will listen more readily if the listening pays. Kenneth's genius is not mind control. It is framing. He persuades rivals to imagine survival as a shared noun. The Viking storm keeps their hands honest. Orkney's jarls do not weep at the idea of Alba. They calculate. Hebridean sea kings keep their own tides. Against such neighbours, the new kingdom learns the lucky art of flexibility. It gathers strength where it can, on hill and in hall, in priory and on mustering ground, and forgives the map its ragged edges. Alba is not a line. It is a concentration. What of the sacred? The church's web, slung by Iona's grandchildren, proves as useful to kings as to souls. Bishops and abbots tie distant glens into a calendar, then into a conversation. Charters begin to speak Latin about Gaelic realities. Law walks with liturgy. A king who can read or be read to has more tools than one who only shouts. The past is invited to legitimize the present. Saints bless borders without drawing them on the wrong side of conscience. Kenneth dies, 858 in the reckoning most accept, and something marvelous doesn't happen. The kingdom does not fall apart. It staggers, yes. It quarrels, certainly. Cousins argue about precedence. as cousins always do, but the idea proves tougher than the man who birthed it. Successors, Constantine, Donald, and others, take the seat on the stone and discover that Alba holds. It holds not because the land is suddenly docile, but because enough people now benefit from imagining it together. From the south, eyes appraise. In a few generations, the island will tremble to the tramp of English kings who fancy themselves engineers of destiny. To face them, Alba will need both memory and muscle. It is getting both. Castles begin to seed the landscape like dental work in a hard-used jaw. Roads of obligation develop, not Roman straight, but reliable enough for a retinue. Men who once knew only clan oaths begin to taste the grammar of realm. And yet, for all the iron, the thing that lasts is softer. It is the story that Pict and Scot became not a quarrel but a coat of arms, that Viking thunder taught unity better than any sermon, that a stone at Scone could persuade a people to share a future. When later centuries argue over who truly rules and by whose right, they will still be arguing inside Kenneth's frame. We, they will say, sometimes angrily, sometimes proudly, but always with that plural that didn't quite exist before. Walk to Scone in your mind. Sit on the grass where the stone of destiny once lifted men into accountability. Press your palm to the earth and wait. You will feel it, not certainty, because history does not offer that, but continuity, the hum of a project still in progress. Alba began because someone dared to name survival as union. It endures because the name fits. Part 7. A name takes hold. Early Alba, Constantine II, Brunanburh. At first it is only a word spoken carefully, as if the mouth must learn a new weight. Alba. A name that once meant the whole island now narrows into a people's wager. Can threads already frayed be woven into a cloth that resists the weather of centuries? After Kenneth MacAlpin, the kings who sit upon stone and ceremony inherit a task more delicate than conquest. They must teach agreement to men who prefer kin to crown, valley to realm and memory to policy. The early throne is a travelling hearth. Kings move like shepherds of obligation, holding courts in halls that smell of peat and cautious loyalty. They write very little themselves, but the church writes for them. Monks measure months, copy laws, send letters to saints' shrines, where intercession and influence might be purchased by the same candle. Between priory and palisade a web is spun, not iron. Calendar and custom, sermon and seal, names gather around the young kingdom like stones around a cairn. One rises higher, Constantine II. He rules late in the 9th and early in the 10th century and discovers that being a king of Alba means keeping several kinds of weather in your head at once. From the north and west, Norse pressure persists, raids, settlements, and those sea kings whose castles are anchored to tide rather than hill. From the south, new ambition hardens under English hands. Across the water, alliances braid and unbraid faster than a scribe can ink. Constantine cultivates a habit: bargain where you can, brace where you must. He stands not on a stage but at a crossroads. Within, Alba still quarrels with itself. Beyond, it must appear as one shape. The church proves its worth as glue. Abbots mediate, bishops bless, and a common rhythm of holy days lets distant glens feel they are tugged by the same moon. A king who kneels before an altar kneels too, before an audience, a realm watching for the posture that means we rather than I. Then comes a field where several futures collide. Brunanburh, year 937. The English king, Ethelstan, gathers power like a millpond gathers sky. Against him moves a coalition: Constantine of Alba, Olaf of Dublin and the Isles, Owain of Strathclyde. An uncommon concert born less of love than of arithmetic. The chronicler's ink runs hot. The poetry afterward sounds like iron sharpening on iron. The English claim victory, and the dead, being exemplary, keep their silence. What matters for Alba is not the tally, but the recognition. Constantine stands on a field where kings are counted, not guessed at. Alba bleeds, retreats, recalculates, and continues. The realm returns north with its name intact. Dented, yes. Deferred, perhaps, but real. Fair people who can lose and remain have already learned a greater skill than winning. Enduring. Back in halls of wood and early stone, sovereignty remains practical. A good reign is often a quiet one. Secure harvests, fewer burned roofs, fewer cousins seeking justice with blades. The king makes circuits, hears disputes, gifts land to monasteries that will, in turn, gift literacy to law. He coaxes more mayors, those great regional lords, into the choreography of service without accusing them of forgetting their own gravity. Fragility never leaves the room. Succession is a puzzle without final solution. Brothers and nephews rehearse their genealogies with the sincerity of prayer. A cough in winter can redraw the map. A marriage can redraw it again. But through the noise, a signal grows. Alba is something more than the hill you see from your doorway, more than the name your grandfather carried like a blade. It is an idea with roots, coastal, riverine, and ecclesiastical, through which obligation can travel faster than resentment. If you want to hear the realm in one sound, listen to boots on wet paths between a church and a chieftain's hall. A messenger carries a writ. A priest carries a blessing. A weaver carries news braided into rumour. Against empires that measure power in straight roads and rows of shields, Alba measures power in relationships, a geometry of favours and mutual need. At dusk in a monastery's cloister, a young monk bends over vellum and inks Alba into a margin, as if to anchor the word to the page more tightly than kings can anchor it to soil. He does not know of the wars that wait, or the famous battles that will claim songs as their spoils. He knows only that a name can hold a people up when swords tire, and outside under a low sky rinsed by rain, the realm he names keeps learning how to stand. Part 8. Stone on the Wind. Castles rise, Stirling, Edinburgh, and the architecture of power. The first castles arrive like new teeth in a jaw set for hard chewing. Motte and Bailey, a timber crown on a mound of earth with a bailey yard hemmed in by palisade and ditch, come with Norman habit and the lesson that height multiplies will. Timber is quick, but timber burns. Stone, patient as winter, is the next vocabulary, and soon the skyline learns a sterner alphabet. Keeps, curtain walls, gatehouses that turn entry into argument. In the lowlands, power chooses crags that already look like thrones. Edinburgh Castle sits upon a volcanic plug, a natural fortress that seems to have risen from the earth specifically to stage sovereignty. Wind prowls the heights. Below, a growing berg trades wool and want with equal vigour. Farther west, Stirling Castle grips its rock above the Forth, a hand closing on the island's narrow waist. The lesson is clear. Whoever holds Stirling edits movement between north and south. History, obedient to terrain, will perform many of its decisive acts beneath these stony balconies. In the Highlands, the language of stone is different. Tower houses and island strongholds that squat close to water and kin. Think of Island Donan, a dream of granite at the confluence of lochs, a house that looks as if the land had grown a guardian. These are not palaces of parade, but refuges built for quick musters and quicker retreats, stone-shaped to resist not only siege but weather. And weather, in Scotland, is a besieger with tenure. Life within is both splendour and discomfort. Great halls glow with tapestries and talk. The draught sneaks anyway, testing every crack like a spy. Smoke blackens beams that have seen 3 generations, swear the same oath with slightly altered sincerity. Kitchens hum, chapels nestle, armories keep their own sour perfume. Ayr Castle is a machine. It stores grain and hostages, pours justice as needed, and displays the theatre of power on a platform of masonry. Castles are also documents written in stone. They announce ownership not only of land but of time. We are not passing through. We are setting down. In charters, a king might grant territory measured in hides and rivers. In castles, he grants confidence measured in shadow. To build is to declare ambition. To garrison is to maintain a sentence. To slight, to dismantle a fortress so enemies cannot use it, is to write no across the page in chisels. During the Wars of Independence, these stone sentences are argued over by 2 crowns with incompatible grammars. English garrisons hold Edinburgh, Stirling, and other teeth along the kingdom's bite. Then come the counter-arguments, night escalades, sham attacks, the courage of small groups multiplying in tight stairwells. A legend grows of men who climb like wind to reclaim a wall 100 times taller than their fear. And later Robert the Bruce, calculating as he is brave, looks at castles and sees a paradox. If you cannot hold them, and cannot allow them to be held against you, then better broken than stolen. Stone falls so that sovereignty may stand. Not all stone is for war. Under the Stuarts, fortresses begin to dream of grace. Linlithgow Palace lifts windows that look like music. Gardens persuade the eye that peace is an asset worth displaying. The Renaissance visits and leaves behind a taste for pattern and show. Even so, the old militaries remain underneath, thick walls that remember sieges even while they host masques and marriages. A castle becomes a stage on which a king can be both commander and curator. Between Highland and Lowland, stone also reveals a social divide. In the north and west, a chief's tower is an extension of the clan's spine, practical, defensive, intimate with the terrain. In the south and east, a lord's castle performs administration, collects dues, holds courts, enforces the crown's long reach. The difference is not simply architectural. It is philosophical. One side trusts kin, the other charter. Scotland will spend centuries learning to braid those two cords without strangling itself. Walk today through a roofless hall where grass keeps the calendar and swallows stitch the air. Place your hand on a wall that outlived its architect and most of his enemies. You can read in the masonry decisions made under duress and under moonlight. Where to put the well, how to angle an arrow slit, when to sacrifice a wing so the whole might stand. Castles are memoirs that weather cannot quite erase. They remember banners and barricades, but they also remember weddings, births, and the good gossip every household produces to survive its own seriousness. When the next chapter's kings appear, some wise, some merely lucky, they will inherit not only borders but buildings that think. Stone teaches rulers to count logistics before laurels. It teaches subjects to measure a lord by the shadow he casts at noon and the shelter he offers at night. And when you hear that a crown has shifted heads, listen for the thud of keys on a table in a cold room. Somewhere a captain hands over a gatehouse, and a realm changes hands. Part 9, The King Behind the Curse, Macbeth, History Not Prophecy. Say the name and the theatre shivers. Macbeth, witchlight, daggers in the air, forests that march because guilt has legs. But step away from the stage and into the 11th century, and you meet a man whose reign reads less like a nightmare and more like a chapter of order in a rough book. He comes from the north, from Moray, where power remembers how to look a king in the eye without blinking. His father, likely Findlaich, holds authority that southern chroniclers sometimes label with suspicion because the north refuses to be a footnote. Macbeth's marriage to Groch, a widow with strong bloodlines, binds him into a web of legitimacy wider than a spear arm. This is not the tale of an upstart with wet hands. This is a claim forged in the fire of custom. The reigning king, Duncan I, is no saintly elder in silks. He is young and ambitious ambition in these centuries travels with steel. In 1040, Duncan campaigns north into Moray and meets Macbeth at Pitgavany near Elgin. The clash is not assassination in a bedroom. It is battle in the open, as common a path to kingship as genealogy, when the law is a living argument. Duncan falls. Macbeth is crowned. Then comes the surprise to any audience trained by later ink. Macbeth rules well for about 17 years. In an age where reigns can be counted in winters, that is an era. He supports the church, sees laws enforced, and empire does not tremble at his name because stability seldom rattles windows. Chronicles even remember a journey that sounds unlikely for a villain. In 1050, Macbeth goes on pilgrimage to Rome. Think of the image, Scotland's king in the eternal city, a traveller among pilgrims, trading gifts and courtesies, placing his rule inside a map larger than his sword arm. Trouble grows, as it always does, along fault lines that are family as much as they are frontier. The exiled sons of Duncan, especially Malcolm, later called Canmore, find friends where kings collect them. The English court, under Edward the Confessor, becomes a foyer for return. In 1054, Siward of Northumbria leads a great host northward to Dunsinane, fighting in support of Malcolm. The sources tangle. Did Macbeth lose decisively or retreat intact after a bruising? Either way, the northern king endures for a time, proof that one battle does not make a reign nor end it. But 1057 breaks the thread. Near Lumphanan in Aberdeenshire, in a fight that smells of heather and necessity, Macbeth falls. His stepson Lulach reigns briefly, too briefly to change the diagnosis, before Malcolm claims the throne as Malcolm III. The dynasty shifts. The story, according to later playwrights, decides to moralize. Enter Shakespeare, writing in the early 17th century, staging a tragedy beneath the eyes of James VI of Scotland, now James I of England. James carries his own genealogy like a banner and a burden, claiming descent from Banquo, a figure the chronicles treat more shakily than the stage does. The playwright, who understands audiences both royal and common, knits flattery and fear into a myth. Macbeth as usurper soaked in blood, Banquo as noble ancestor wronged but rewarded by prophecy. The crown's current head reflected in a line of sovereign mirrors. It is brilliant theatre and brittle history. The real Macbeth does not creep. He commands. He is not devoured by hallucination. He is resisted by politics. His fall is not a lightning bolt of divine ethics. It is a campaign, one defeat then another, the slow math of power correcting itself. As for the moving forest and the air-drawn dagger, keep them. They are true to guilt if not to chronicle. Every king in a hard age lives with ghosts of choices, and woodlands often look animated when your scouts come late. What then survives when we strip the stage of its spells? A king whose longevity argues for competence. A realm that, for nearly 2 decades, knew a steadier law than usual. A pilgrimage that places Scotland in conversation with Rome, at a time when such conversations were passports to wider influence. And a fall that reminds us even a good steward of order cannot indefinitely outtalk dynastic claim, backed by foreign steel. When later centuries recite Macbeth's name as shorthand for tyranny, let them also remember the administrator, the patron, the man whose north did not melt beneath him until politics, stubborn, local and assisted from abroad, made another choice. History has room for both truths, the play that explores the conscience and the profile that records the crown. Stand for a moment on a hill above Lumfernan. The wind is clean. The grass holds faint memory of iron. The sky has opinions and keeps them. Somewhere between heather and haze a king fell, and a story rose. One is verifiable. The other is valuable. Scotland, whose history learned very early to love both the measurable and the meaningful, keeps them together and walks on. Part 10. Mail and Oaths. Norman Knights, Feudal Bonds, New Traditions. Imagine a rider in chain mail bright as rain on Riverstone, a pennon tugging at the wind, hooves printing law into the earth. He is not native to this valley, yet the valley will learn his name. The Normans, descendants of Vikings who traded longships for landed titles in Normandy, arrive in Scotland, not by tidal wave, but by a careful tide. Marriages, alliances and invitations from kings who need dependable steel and orderly service. After 1066, when William the Conqueror remakes England, the North feels the tremor. Malcolm Canmore and those who follow see a toolkit they can use, armoured cavalry, disciplined retinues, stone castles that argue for permanence, and a political grammar called feudalism. Land held in exchange for service, rights tallied like measures in a psalm. Knights arrive with their oaths already polished, ready to kneel and rise with a purpose the crown can count. At first, the Normans plant motte and bailey forts, quick timber crowns on earthy mounds. Soon stone replaces haste, keeps that look like decisions. Curtain walls that turn approach into negotiation, gatehouses that make courtesy part of security. Castle by castle, the landscape begins to speak in a new accent. Where Edinburgh and Stirling once watched in native silence, their outlines sharpen with continental confidence. But the change is deeper than masonry. The feudal bond rearranges loyalty. Where a Highland chief wraps duty in kinship, a Norman lord wraps it in charter and seal. A king who yesterday depended on cousinly goodwill can now summon knightly service by parchment. Below those lords a ladder descends. Vassals, free tenants, sergeants, each rung bound by promises legible enough to be copied in a scriptorium. Power, once personal and seasonal, learns to schedule itself. With the knights come names that will later glow like embers in Scotland's story. De Bru, Bruce, Stewart, the High Steward's line, de Morville, and others whose heraldry frames future drama. They bring the idea of knighthood itself, armour as identity, chivalry as a code pretending to be ethics, tournaments and pageantry that teach even enemies how to admire one another. For young nobles a new ladder of honour rises, squire, banneret, lord, each step oiled by service and spectacle. The church too tilts toward the continent. Bishops learn to count in canon law. Abbeys are reordered. Cathedrals lift ribbed stone that looks like prayer learned from geometry. The Roman rhythm of reform reaches into the glens. Liturgy made regular, dioceses drawn neat. Monastic orders with rules as tight as a mailed fist. Benedictines, Cistercians, Augustinians arrive to plant literacy and discipline like forests that will outlive kings. Latin becomes the common tongue of paperwork, and with it, Scotland adds an international dial tone to its phone of power. Not everyone applauds. In the Highlands, where Gaelic still sings and cattle still define wealth, kinship does not consent to be replaced by ledger. The Lowlands, closer to England and trade, adopt the new forms more readily. Burrs spring up with markets and guilds. Charters stamp privilege onto streets. Coin learns to pass from hand to hand with the authority of a king's face. The nation divides without breaking, one world counting kin, the other counting contracts. To walk through this era is to feel two clocks tick in the same room. On one wall, a clan timepiece measures seasons of transhumance, feuds paused for harvest, raids governed by honor older than paper. On another wall, a feudal clock ticks to the rhythm of scutage, relief, wardship, duties and dues that lawyers can argue even when swords have been sheathed. Kings learn to translate between them or be broken by the misunderstanding. And yet Scotland does not become Norman. It becomes Scotland with Normans, an alloy stronger than either metal alone. The crown borrows what it needs, stonecraft, cavalry, law, and keeps what it must, independence. Gaelic heartlands, a suspicion of southern appetite. Even those Norman families who will later lead Scotland's wars, the Bruces, the Stuarts, are not foreign anymore. They are naturalized by duty and dirt, their fortunes tied to fields that remember their steps. Watch a knight ride through a lowland burg. Children run close to marvel at the clatter. A weaver looks up from his loom and calculates thread to coin. A priest notes the banner and thinks of which saint will be pleased to see it at the next dedication. Along the same road, a Highland drover will pass 2 days later with a river of cattle, speaking to them in a language older than the street. Both travellers belong. The road, like the realm, learns to carry two kinds of belonging without apology. Feudalism brings with it order and friction. Justice becomes a place, the Lord's Hall, the Sheriff Court, where disputes are measured before they're avenged. But obligations bite. When a levy is called, men march because parchment says so, not only because pride does. When ransom is due, arithmetic hurts. And yet from these pains arise conveniences. Roads maintained, bridges kept, markets protected. Weights and measures made honest enough for strangers to trade without drawing knives first. By the time our story tilts toward open defiance of England, Scotland is armoured in new ways. Its castles are not only walls, they are archives. Its nobility is not only brave, it is networked. Its church is not only devout, it is connected to Rome in ways that amplify pleas and curses alike. And in this new ecosystem, an unlikely figure will rise. Not a lord with a Latin seal, but a common man with a cry that outshouts parchments. His name is a flame that does not go out when doused in water. Part 11. A spark named Wallace. The wars of independence begin. The country feels heavy with somebody else's decisions. Edward III of England, the hammer of the Scots, seeks to turn a neighbouring kingdom into a well-behaved province. Crowns taken into custody, castles garrisoned, nobles made to kneel with words that taste like chalk. After the death of Alexander III and the collapse of clean succession, Scotland's throne becomes a chessboard. Edward insists on playing as if he owned the board. Rebellion, when it first stirs, is not a trumpet. It is a heartbeat. It starts in a village, perhaps at a bridge where a sheriff's man behaves as if he were a king's man, or in a tavern where insult snaps a tether already frayed by hunger. The name William Wallace arrives in rumour before it arrives in chronicles. He is not of royal blood. He is taller than the world expects a peasant to be, quick with blade and quicker with outrage that sounds like justice. He strikes, first small, then larger. Garrisons wake to doors that refuse to be doors. Patrols do not return. The countryside remembers how to hide a man the law wants. Wallace draws to him those who have less to lose than a lord and more to gain than a sermon. Farmers, craftsmen, disappointed knights, men who do not want to explain to their children why submission is wisdom. The rebellion blooms like heather, familiar, stubborn, everywhere at once. Then Stirling Bridge, 1297, a narrow crossing over the Forth, where Andrew Moray fights beside Wallace, and strategy walks hand in hand with luck. The English force, greedy with confidence, tries to pour across a choke point. Wallace waits, counts, and when the bridge holds enough enemy to satisfy mathematics, he closes the book. Knights who imagine the world will make room for their horses find the river's edge a poor listener. The victory is more than numbers. It is a correction, a nation remembering its height after months of walking bent. For a breathless year, Wallace becomes guardian of Scotland, steward of a throne whose rightful occupant is absent or contested. He is awkward at court because fire is awkward in a library. He writes letters. One survives to Lubeck and Hamburg, bragging for Scotland's merchants that the sea is open again. He governs like a man who knows war will return tomorrow, and that governance, too, is a kind of war. Against hunger, against fear, against forgetting who we are. War does return, with an English army too big for comfort and confident in lessons learned. Falkirk, 1298. Wallace sets schiltrons, tight circles and squares of spears bristling like hedgehogs, a human palisade. But archers darken the air, cavalry find the seams, the line buckles. Defeat is not dishonor, but it is merciless. Wallace yields the guardianship. Nobles, some jealous, some pragmatic, step forward, step back, step sideways as politics dictates. The flame does not go out, but it burns with less oxygen. Wallace slips into the shade a leader learns to love. Guerrilla paths, safe houses, the long patience of a hunted man. He is betrayed, most safer silver, which has always been talented in changing hands, and taken to London for a trial that is not a trial, so much as a message written in iron. He answers treason with a truth no court can swallow. He never swore fealty to the king who accuses him. They kill him in a way meant to frost the spine of anyone who might repeat his argument. We will not describe their craft. We will not give fear the cinematography it craves, instead remain with the result. Wallace becomes not a man but a music. A tune boy's whistle on roads that lead to musters, a word women speak when they hand a spear to the hand that will not come home, a story that chooses courage over likelihood. His name walks before other names and opens doors they might not have reached. When years later, another man with Norman letters in his surname and Gaelic earth in his blood stakes everything on a field near Stirling, Wallace's spark will be there. Inside the breath of every Scot who bends a knee to plant a spear, it is possible to be ordinary and change the architecture of possibility. That is Wallace's gift. Kings will stand on stones and claim they rule by right. He stands on anger and refusal, and proves a nation can be guarded for a season by a man who never owned more than his honor. Empires like to call that accident. We call it permission, granted to every soul who sees a line drawn across their life and decides the line is a lie. Part 12. A hedgehog of spears. Robert the Bruce and Bannockburn. If Wallace is a spark, Robert the Bruce is the forge, hotter, slower, more deliberate, capable of shaping the iron that a moment of fire reveals. His name tells one story, de Bruce Norman by origin, but his hunger tells another, Scotland as inheritance not merely by claim but by commitment. His rise is not clean. Scotland's politics is a thicket of families, Bruce and Comyn chief among them, each with a case to present to history, each with swords to underline the footnotes. In 1306, in Greyfriars Church at Dumfries, Bruce meets John Comyn. Words fail, violence speaks. Comyn falls where only prayer should kneel. Bruce is crowned soon after, king and outcast in one crown, and the church thunders. Excommunication sits on his shoulders like a winter that refuses to end. The first years read like a losing diary. Defeats. Family captured or killed. Friends scattered. A king who sleeps more in caves than in chambers. He learns from failure the way smart men do, by changing. He abandons the dream of crushing set-piece clashes and takes up the geography as ally. Hills, bogs, forests and night become his generals. He strikes where arithmetic is bad at counting, vanishes where pride thinks pursuit unnecessary. Little victories add like coins in a jar, small to each ear, heavy to the hand that lifts them all at once. And then, somewhere in these harsh semesters, the country redecides itself. Men who watched Bruce with suspicion begin to measure him by results. Burned English outposts, recovered fortresses, laws administered in places the crown had forgotten, clan chiefs treated as partners, not furniture. He destroys castles he cannot hold, so the enemy cannot hold them either. Better broken than stolen becomes royal policy. His signature grows legible in smoke and law alike. Now set a summer scene, June 1314, fields near Stirling, the air heavy as if the land is holding its breath. Edward II of England brings numbers, an army large enough to be convinced of itself, a supply train that thinks it is inevitable. Bruce brings knowledge, of ground, of men, of what refusal looks like when it stands shoulder to shoulder. He chooses terrain that insults cavalry, marshy ground, narrow approaches, concealed pits. He seeds the grass with Scottish patience. On the eve or very morning, an English knight, Henry de Bohun, sees Bruce riding ahead and tries to make history with a lance. The moment is theatre and test. Bruce does not flee. He sidesteps, rises in the saddle, and with one arcing blow of an axe meets iron with intention. We do not linger on the wound. We note the meaning. His men see a king who will not let anyone write their fate for them. Morale, that invisible animal, grows suddenly large. The battle extends over 2 days. The English seek the decisive charge that their manuals promise. The ground replies with mud and confusion. The Scottish schiltrons, dense forests of spears, stand like hedgehogs the size of villages, punishing horses that cannot find honourable footing. English archers are dangerous until counter-raids and tangled space cramp their art. Somewhere in the trample and shout, the arithmetic that arrived so confident loses count. By the second day, the English army is tired of its own size. Retreat looks like a commandment whispered by the marsh. Panic chooses its favourites and runs. Edward II survives, but not the conceit that numbers always win. In the grass and mud of Bannockburn, a smaller army remembers a nation into solidity. Victory is not merely tactical. It is sacramental, a blessing spoken over a people who have waited too long to hear it. Yet the war does not end when cheering does. Scotland still must negotiate in steel and ink. 6 years later, the Declaration of Arbroath, 1320, gives words to what Bannockburn gave blood, a letter to the Pope insisting that freedom is not the property of a king, but the birthright of a people, for as long as 100 of us remain alive. We paraphrase, we do not quote. It is political poetry sharpened by necessity, a national creed mailed to Rome. Bruce rules with a builder's eye. He restores, reforms, and rewards. He knows a crown is a tool, not a halo. It must hammer roads people trust. He makes peace where he can, within Scotland first, then with neighbours when the balance allows. Years will pass before England writes the proper acknowledgement. But Bannockburn has moved the argument from whether Scotland exists to how she will be addressed. Walk the field on a modern evening when the wind is busy with the grass and the sky rehearses its blues. Try to hear it, the bristle of spears, the clatter of courage, the quiet afterward, when men remember to breathe. History will say strategy and terrain. Legend will say destiny. The truth, braver than both, says work. The long, disciplined willingness to be one when being many would be easier. In that willingness, Wallace's spark still burns, smaller, steadier, inside the forge that Bruce tended until iron held its shape. Scotland will have other trials, other crowns, other unions to argue about. But from this field forward, she knows something about herself that cannot be made to forget.